Good afternoon. I know you're out there. I heard all the people on the web saying good afternoon, but nobody in the room saying good afternoon. All right, that's good. I know you've had lunch, but Josh and Samantha are going to keep you awake this afternoon, I promise you. I am David Carmichael. For those of you who weren't here this morning, I'm the director of the State Archives and the State Archivist, and I welcome you to this ARM conference. This is the third time we have done this where we webcast as well as have people in the room, and we've gotten very good feedback about that format. And so I appreciate those of you who are in the room because it does help the speakers to have people they can actually look at and react to. And I encourage you to ask questions as the day goes along, and even the people online can ask questions as well. So there are a few housekeeping items that I need to get out of the way before we get started here. Firstly, I need to thank Commonwealth Media Service for giving us this room and also doing all of the technical work that we need to be able to webcast this. They have helped us every year. And Tug, we appreciate you and your team for all that you're doing to help us get this going. I also want to thank Cindy Bendroth, who again, if you weren't here this morning, she's not in the room at the moment, but she's the person who many of you interact with in our records management program. And I thank her for her work. Josh Stahlman, who is one of your speakers this afternoon, works for Cindy, and he has worked very hard to make this happen today. And Tyler Stump, who will be here in a moment, will be in the back taking questions from the people who are joining us on the web. So I appreciate all the work that they did. I thank the State Historical Records Advisory Board for their sponsorship of this day. And as I did this morning, I want to thank again John Paul Deli and Andy Masick and the Heinz History Center for setting up a satellite area for us in Pittsburgh where people are joining this webinar from the Heinz History Center. So thank you, John Paul and Andy, for doing that. If you are online this afternoon, there is about a 25-second delay between what happens here and what you see. I don't know why, but it does happen. I've been told that on the Chrome browser, the delay isn't quite as long, so you might try that. I don't know. But if you are watching, there is a question button right below where you're seeing me at the moment, or you're going to see me in 25 seconds, I guess. And you can submit questions that way. Tyler will be picking those up and reading them to the speakers. We will have time for questions at the end, but if you have a burning question, please feel free to ask it while we're going. If you're in the room, again, if you weren't here this morning, we are filming, and if you ask a question, you will be on camera. If you don't want to be on camera, the seats in the back along the wall are not going to be filmed. So if you stay in the seats up here, which I hope you will, we will assume you're acquiescing to our filming you if need be. Okay. So, how many of you were here this morning at the... Okay, most of you. So I will not repeat what I said this morning, except to say that, again, you see from the conference today the emphasis that the State Archives puts on protecting records and preserving records and making them accessible to people. And this is just a long-standing emphasis of ours, and these sessions today are just reinforcing that as well. We had a PDFA session this morning. And now this afternoon, we're going to be talking about disaster. I'm going to read it from here. Building blocks to records readiness. The SHRAB, the State Historic Records Advisory Board, has been working on a maturity model that people can use to sort of judge where they are in preparedness, and a very easy to use model, and that's what we're going to be referring to today, as you'll see. Our speakers are Samantha Forsko and Josh Stahlman. Samantha is the preservation specialist at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts in Philadelphia, a great partner on much of what we do. She's also the project manager for the Pennsylvania Cultural Resilience Network, PaCRN, which is attempting to improve emergency response and preparedness for cultural institutions across the Commonwealth. And what Samantha does is she has helped create and probably largely personally created across the state teams of responders who can respond to a disaster that affects cultural heritage resources, whether those are records, artworks, buildings, historic buildings and such. And she is providing training for these people. We've been very honored to assist in some of that, and we've held hands-on training where you stand in water, and well, where the participants stand in water. I don't. I watch. And recover materials that have gotten wet and such, and so that when there's a disaster, we actually have people across the state who are trained to go out and help respond to that and preserve cultural artifacts. So Samantha is a great person and a great help to the Commonwealth. Josh Stahlman is an archivist in the Pennsylvania State Archives. I can speak very personally to his work, and he does terrific work. I can tell you he's very well versed in disaster planning and response. He's one of the people who trains on essential records. He trains local governments. He trains state agencies. He works with Samantha on this network of responders. He cut his teeth, in a sense, in the Intergovernmental Preparedness for Essential Records project, the IPER project from years ago that I know a little something about. And so that's where he first, I think, got involved in disaster preparedness. And so he is a very good person to be leading us through these topics. So that is enough introduction. Without further ado, who's going first? Josh. All right, Josh. Thank you. Thank you, Josh.
All right. Well, good afternoon to everyone. And as David said, welcome, and we appreciate you coming out and taking the time to be here with us this afternoon. We'll get started today just talking a little bit about an overview. As David mentioned, the project, the building blocks for records preparedness. We'll discuss how that project came to be and ultimately what we're working to talk about here today. As you can see on the screen, essentially we're going to discuss 4 topics today: essential records, disaster preparedness, disaster recovery. These topics are important regardless if you're a continuity of operations planner, COOP planner, records manager, records coordinator, if you're a representative of local government, or even a historical records repository. Certainly, often when we think of planning for an emergency or a disaster, many times, of course, human safety, individuals are taken into account, and that's certainly going to be at the forefront of all of this. This is all secondary to human life, but in too many cases, it's the human life and the facilities that are addressed in the disaster plan or the emergency planning, and records and collections aren't necessarily addressed in those planning components. So we want to sort of stress the importance of addressing and working to protect those records or those collections. And in some cases, as we talk about today, it's even going to be the case that those records are going to be important to the response effort itself. Ultimately, we want to minimize disruption and loss, both to our capability to function, as well as to the records and those collections themselves. And certainly, I would imagine many of us, if not personally affected by the flooding over this summer, we may have known someone who was, or certainly seen the news reports of the buildings and facilities that have been so hard hit by water this year. So as David mentioned, at the end of the presentation, we'll allow time for questions. If you do have questions throughout, we'll certainly address those as well, but we do have a few minutes built in at the end for questions. And we will close up with an on-site activity, and we'll talk more about that as we approach that. David acknowledged the SHRAB and thanked the SHRAB. One of the components of that, both this seminar and this project specifically were funded by a National Historical Publications and Records Commission grant, State Board Programming grant, which is something that allows us to offer these resources and these tools and to begin sharing this information with our peers and colleagues and those of us that are tasked with records care. Without further ado, we give you the building blocks to records readiness. The title here is certainly better than what we had originally come up with, which was Building Blocks to Disaster Success. And while that's certainly an appropriate title, when you looked at it on paper, something just didn't sit right with disaster and success being right next to each other like that. So we're fortunate that David came up with this improved title, and I think this certainly fits a little bit better. But as David alluded to, the SHRAB had this initiative and this idea to sort of create this tool. And again, this was part of that National Historical Publications and Records Commission grant. And David, in conjunction with the SHRAB, came up with the idea to create this sort of matrix where you can see the matrix on the screen here. I don't know that you can read it, but you can certainly see it. Each one of these topics on the left, there are the essential records, of course, disaster preparedness, disaster response, and ultimately recovery. Each one of those topics has 5 steps to lead you to what we're calling here a preparedness leader. Okay. Each one of those steps, there are indications of what you would need to do to identify yourself at that level, but then to progress to the next step as well. So ultimately, we would like to see everybody at a level 5 as a preparedness leader as an ideal. We have the steps here. Currently, this exists as a document. Within the coming months, we hope to make this an online tool that each one of these cells will actually link out to additional information that you'll be able to then look at more comprehensive material to guide you in that progress to ultimately becoming a preparedness leader. We will send this out as a PDF as well, the existing document, but again, ultimately this will be a little bit more interactive as a web-facing tool. So I'm going to talk about essential records today, and I think essential records may warrant a little bit of explanation as to what they are, why they're important. Some of us may know of essential records as vital records, and for years the two terms were used interchangeably. More recently, actually specifically post-Katrina, there's been a push to address or sort of disambiguate the two terms, vital from essential. Vital records tend to be birth, marriage, death records, things of that nature. So we want to make that distinction here that essential records are something unique and specific, and we'll talk about exactly what those are. So if you would walk into someone's office and ask them what records in this office are essential, what do you think you're going to hear? Somebody's probably going to be inclined to say all of my records, right? Well, unfortunately, that's not always the case. And we, those of us, I should say, who are in the historical records repositories, archivists and so forth, we might be inclined to say all of our records are essential records. Well, that might not always be the case. As we talk today, we'll sort of determine and establish that essential records are sort of a limited component of the records that you hold. And we'll talk about basically there's two things, there's two ways to break it down. Essentially, there's going to be those records that are needed immediately following a disaster, and those that ultimately are essential to your function and your operations, okay? So the first type of those records are going to be your emergency operating records. And you might want to think of these as a paper fire extinguisher, if you will. And that might even be a little bit misleading to call it a paper fire extinguisher because really essential records can be in any format, certainly more commonly in electronic format as well. But again, these are the things that are needed immediately following a disaster that are going to allow you to effectively, efficiently respond to a disaster scenario or situation. You can see some examples on the slide, whether this is an emergency or disaster plan, employee lists, phone trees, delegations of authorities, various contracts. And I think as I say those things, you might start to think, or hopefully start to think, that these might be components of what Samantha's later going to talk about with disaster planning. These might actually be components of your disaster plan. I do want to point out the last thing on the slide there is essential records inventories. That's one of the components that I'm going to talk about here in these first several slides. Certainly a critical consideration as we think about our essential records. The second type of essential record, or categorization of essential records really, it's going to be more voluminous types of records, or there's going to be more volume of records. These are going to be those records that you need to resume and continue operations following an emergency or disaster situation. These are things that protect your legal and financial rights, the things that we need to satisfy those obligations that we have, whether it's to our constituents, to the public, whatever the case might be. And you can see some examples again. And certainly when you think about things like an insurance document or insurance documentation during a disaster, you can certainly imagine why those types of records might get a workout, why they might be important and needed immediately. Things like payroll, accounts payable. Just because you've been faced with a disaster situation, you're still going to be accountable to those who are requiring your money, in this case, if you will. If your employees, your staff, you ultimately want them to still be reporting to work and supporting those functions that we'll talk a little bit more about as well. Accounts receivable, similarly, you can't necessarily anticipate that just because you are in a particular situation that there's going to be people lining up saying, hey, we owe you money. Things like IT documentation and backups. Ultimately, are you going to be able to access records off-site? And as we talk about backing up our essential records, are these going to be able to be things that we are able to access as well? So why is it important? Again, essential records are things that define people's rights, again, document your obligations, secure economic well-being, and ultimately provide identity to communities in many cases. Without them, in many cases, you're going to be unable to effectively or efficiently respond to a disaster or an emergency situation. You may ultimately encounter disruption to the services that you provide. Unfortunately, you may become, as time progresses, subject or vulnerable to litigation or other financial vulnerabilities. And worst case scenario, it may cripple your ability altogether to recover and ultimately resume operations after a disaster situation. So now we know a little bit, generally speaking, about what essential records are. We can see here on the slide that top left-hand corner there is actually pulled right from that disaster matrix. So this, in this case, is going to be your level 1 awareness. Again, we're in the essential records column. In this case, we're talking about awareness of two things. We're talking about your essential functions as well as your stakeholders. And those two things are certainly linked or tied together. But first, sort of identifying your essential functions. So thinking about all the functions you or your office or your agency provide, the essential functions are going to be those that you need to continue regardless of operating conditions. And ultimately, we want to make sure that these are continued with minimal disruption. Because interruption for even a short period would ultimately compromise our mission. And we think about our mission, ultimately, we'll be looking to things like mission statements, strategic plans, and consulting with executive staff to sort of determine, again, what those critical functions and roles are, those things that we have to continue providing. Okay. So second, or sort of tangential to that, we look at identifying stakeholders. Okay. So we talked about, or we're thinking about what those essential functions are. What are the functions that we provide to individuals? So we're talking about stakeholders. What services in particular do we provide to those stakeholders that can't be found elsewhere? And generally speaking, as we think about state agencies, local government offices, in many cases the public is going to be a large component of our stakeholders, right? So we need to think about how to address those stakeholders and see what their needs are of those services that we provide. What are those critical or those most important functions that we provide to those stakeholders? So you can certainly solicit a simple interview, a simple questionnaire to begin determining what those functions are that they rely on, they depend on from you. And once you've identified your essential functions, you've identified your stakeholders, then we can progress to level 2, which in this case, level 2 is basic plan. So we've talked about identifying the functions and the stakeholders. So now we ultimately want to identify what those records are. That's what we're really talking about here today, is the essential records. So again, as you can imagine, the records that support those essential functions and the records that support those functions that are critical to your stakeholders are going to be your essential records. And it's going to vary from office to office, the volume of material that you might be anticipating. A general rule of thumb would be about 3 to 5% of any given office's records might be considered essential records. We want to remember that essential records are necessary for emergency response. necessary to resume or continue operations. They protect health, property, and safety. They would require massive resources to reconstruct, and they protect the history of communities, families, and businesses. So once we've identified what those essential records are, we can really address what, this is the second component of level 2, that basic plan. And this is really the core foundation, is actually creating a written inventory of those records. And we're sort of tacking on a little bit of a records management component here because it's beneficial or maybe even necessary to have a comprehensive knowledge of the office's records as you go to identify those records that are going to be essential. So if you're able to actually conduct a physical inventory of what records are in an office or an agency or otherwise, that's going to go a long way as you work to establish which of those records are essential. So again, you can see creating an essential records inventory when you want to denote what the individual record series are, the location of the records, the location of the backups, what the format of those records are, if they're paper records, microform, or if they're electronic, and as well as access priorities. And access priorities essentially means how quickly are you going to need to get to those records? How quickly will those records be needed, particularly in a disaster situation? So with that inventory, again, sort of being the core or the foundation, that's going to give us the key to move on to level 3. In this case, a comprehensive plan, and you can see certainly there's 2 steps here, the second of which is incorporating that inventory into your disaster plan or your COOP plan, or both. But first, we want to identify what our risks are to our essential records. And we think about risks, we might be thinking about things like civil disruptions. You can certainly consider things like riots, arson, looting, things of that nature. There's certainly the other big headline-making things, floods, earthquakes, tornadoes, and things of that nature. Poor records management. I got to get those records management jabs in where I can as well. But records management, again, being critical. If your records are poorly managed, you're not going to be able to find them. And that can present a real problem as well. But generally speaking, when we're talking about disasters, mechanical, physical, technological are going to be the big things that we're probably going to face as far as identifying the risks to the records. So whether that's going to be an HVAC issue, a structural issue, the location of your records. So if you're able to physically conduct a survey, so a site survey, actually taking a critical eye and looking at your record storage areas and identifying if you have records stored underneath of plumbing that's known to leak or things of that nature, looking for other structural deficiencies. Certainly taking into account security. Are the spaces secure? Who has access to those spaces? So again, in that notion, we're conducting a physical site survey to identify the risks. And once we identify what the risks are, we can ultimately establish the probability and the impact. And we'll talk more about that and how that's important in a moment. But again, we said also part of that is incorporating that inventory. Again, that inventory is going to be the core principle as we talk about working with our essential records. We need to know what those essential records are and where they are as we move forward. And Samantha will talk more about disaster planning, but moving forward, just being able to identify quickly where those records are, particularly when we talk about first responders, if we're talking about material safety data sheets or things like that, you want to be able to find and access that information quickly. So incorporating that in that disaster plan is going to go a long way to assist you there. Level 4, having an established program. In this case, we talked about identifying risks. Now we're talking about actually mitigating those risks and actively protecting records. So again, those 2 things sort of go hand in hand. We talked about doing the site survey. So we're establishing what that risk assessment would be. And when we ultimately do that, we can then provide that information to resource allocators, both for financial purposes, but also to be convincing for time and space. As we think about moving records to different locations or buying supplies or rectifying situations with facilities, we can prioritize those actions, as I said, based then on how high of a probability something is to occur and how high of an impact it ultimately would have. And those things with the lower risk excuse me, might just justify acceptance. Ideally, if we can get records, boxes, containers at least 6 inches up off the ground, ideally, again, heavy gauge steel shelving. But more practically speaking, even if we can just get things up onto a pallet, it's going to get things up off the floor. If we identify that we have records in a basement area, particularly essential records, if we can get those out of that area and just into a climate-controlled office, a space that's regularly monitored, that's going to be a big improvement over having them in those vulnerable areas. And that ultimately is going to move us one step closer to becoming a preparedness leader. So we've talked about establishing the plan, doing the inventory, all these components, establishing what the risks might be. Ultimately, this isn't going to be a static process or a static document. We're going to need to review the plan probably annually. We think about things like disaster plans, the staff that are assigned particular responsibilities, those roles might change, contact information might change. Essential records designations can change. Things that might be essential today might not be in 2 years from now. And the converse of that is true as well. And certainly the location of records can change. So again, periodically reviewing that information and updating as necessary. Part of the protection process, the ongoing protection process, is making sure that we have off-site copies or backups where appropriate. And excuse me, as we talked about this morning, that's becoming more and more prevalent with electronic records. Ultimately, if we have things off-site, as long as they're accessible, and especially now as we think about things like cloud storage where things are accessible from anywhere, again, having those records backed up. And ultimately, those things that we need, we said there's the 2 types of essential records, the one being those records that are needed immediately to respond to a disaster, particularly disaster plans. If we can keep those things readily available, readily accessible, even if staff might have those things at home or keep them in their car as like a grab-and-go type of kit, that's going to go a long way as well. But again, it comes back to that being an ongoing process of those materials being updated and those outdated materials being replaced periodically. So that's a quick run-through of level 1 through 5 of essential records. We'll bring Samantha up now for disaster preparedness.
Great, thank you, Josh. Well, I'm going to start off with a story you guys probably already know about. I know we all saw this in the news, the National Museum in Brazil, the massive fire that happened. And a lot of the reason why we all heard about this was because they were not really in any way prepared. And the preparedness is really what counts in a lot of this. A lot of people talk about how terrible the response was for this, how much was lost, how many materials were lost during that recovery phase. But it's actually their preparedness that got them in trouble, right? They didn't have, systems, the mechanical systems were not updated. They didn't have an ongoing relationship with their local fire companies. Their buildings weren't up to code. They didn't have smoke detectors. So that was the reason. It wasn't all just those response recovery parts that didn't go well. It were these preparedness steps that got them in trouble. So disaster preparedness is the planning and activities prior to a disaster that help ensure an efficient response and minimize damage of materials. And a lot of those steps are not very fun or flashy. They're kind of the more simple day-to-day things, right? Checking to see that your smoke detectors are actually working on a regular basis. I know that's super fun, right? Making sure your buildings are up to code. Who doesn't like paperwork, right? They're not always the most fun things to do, but doing these sort of somewhat tedious tasks are really your best bet at having an efficient and effective response if a disaster should happen. I've never heard of anyone going through a disaster saying that they spent too much time on planning ahead of time. So this is really where we can make the biggest impact. So let's go through the building blocks for the disaster preparedness column. The first step is awareness, as Josh was talking about. You really want to make sure that the message of being prepared is something that is understood by your staff at the entire institution. The best way is really to have that directive come from the top down. So in order to be there, we have sort of the first thing listed as the leadership of your organization must acknowledge the need for the plan for records-related emergencies and be committed to starting that process. You can plan all day, plan till you're blue in the face, but if you don't get the buy-in from upper management, it's going to be really difficult to make that be effective. So how do you do that, you might ask? How do you get people sort of on board with doing this disaster planning process? Because it's not easy. So how do you make people understand that this is something that is worth spending time and resources on? Something that I found is effective is sharing stories about other disasters that have gone on. I know after the news broke about that Brazil museum fire, I got tons of phone calls at where I work, CCAHA, about how to sort of improve disaster planning at other people's institutions. So it might seem, like that's kind of a sad thing, right? You're taking the really tragic event and you're kind of making lemons out of lemonade, or lemonade out of lemons, right? So we want to do that when we can. If there are particular items in your collection that are very susceptible to damage, as Josh was mentioning, identifying those risks, going through that risk assessment, it would be really helpful to, point those out, point out that precarious location that things are in, especially if, upper management has a particular fondness to some particular records or particular artifacts, point out what could possibly damage them. It's also really helpful to bring in numbers when you can. How much did recoveries cost versus how much their mitigation measures would have cost to help get buy-in? One of my favorite stories, you guys can Google this one later, but many years ago at the University of New Mexico, they had an assessment done on their main library location to see how much it would cost to install a fire suppression system. They discovered that it would cost about $1 million to install the system, which is pretty expensive, right? And the upper administration kind of figured, what is the likelihood? Not likely. That's not an institutional priority. You guys see where this is going, right? So a year later from that, in the middle of the night, a fire started, unknown source where it started from, and it ended up costing them $17 million in damage. So I think when you put numbers like that right next to each other, you can obviously see the $1 million investment is much better than the $17 million. I'm currently working with a site. I work all over the country in doing this. I'm working with a site in Mississippi right now they had a massive fire in one of their buildings, and they're on year 5 of their recovery, and it's already cost them $2 million. So that's in addition to they've been closed for parts of that time. So that just counts the building, what they're building. So if you're able to kind of dig up those stories, I am always just like bookmarking stories that I see where any of that, and I save them on a file. So if you are having trouble getting institutional buy-in, money talks. So if you can get some of that, you can really help with that and being able to achieve this level. Getting that leadership commitment. To move over to the next level, once you get that buy-in, that's where kind of the real work begins, right? Where you get to begin writing your disaster plan. And that is a big task. It is not easy. I'm with you on that. So it's kind of broken down into 2 levels here. We have the basic plan and a comprehensive plan in our building blocks here. But you want to start with something, just starting basic is a good way to go with it. I do, as I mentioned, work with a lot of institutions and writing plans. A full comprehensive plan can take years to write. But you don't know when a disaster is going to hit, so it's super important to have something, right, at all times. So, while it's okay to give yourself time, you don't want to make it be open-ended, right? Have timelines and goals, but feel free to kind of start small with it. Something I like to do, one of my favorite tools, is the pocket response plan, which I have some samples out on the tables for you guys to take a look at, and you should share with other tables around you. If you're watching online, you can go to the Council of State Archivists website, and there are samples there and a downloadable template. So this is a really good tool to start with. It kind of, you can see looking through them, it lines out some of the places to start looking at fleshing out more. It gathers some contact information for you. It's a really awesome tool to start sort of compiling that crucial information that you would need. Sections include, staff contact, vendor contact, those first initial steps that you need to take. The ones you're looking at right now are from actual places, so you can see how they've modified them to work out what is specific about their institutions. So if, a disaster plan just seems too huge, too big to start even, think about writing, you can start something small like this. It's a great way to break it down into smaller goals that you can achieve quickly, and then you have something for while you're working on fleshing out that larger plan. So as I mentioned, there's a free template available on the Council of State Archivists website. You can download it in a Word document so that you can modify it however you might want to. I've seen people, drop in floor plans, put pictures of some of their most important artifacts in there. The idea is it's customizable, so it really kind of gets your creative juices flowing, writing that full-blown plan just a little bit easier. There are other online tools that you can use to help with the planning process as well. There's something called D-Plan out there, which is an online tool where you sort of enter information and then it spits out a plan for you in the end. It's definitely something that you need to still review and make sure that it actually applies to you, but it's a great way to, again, tackle this really sort of daunting project. D-Plan is managed through NEDCC, which is the Northeast Document Conservation Center. And if you go look at it right now, it's a little bit clunky looking. It's from about 2005, and the website definitely looks like it. I do happen to know that they are doing a redo of it, and it will be relaunched hopefully within the next year. So a thing to keep your eye on. That will be helpful. This book here is another really helpful, The Field Guide to Disaster Preparedness. This is something that comes out through the Foundation for the American Institute of Conservation, FAIC. And it has, I can pass this around here, you can find a copy online as well, but it has some really good templates and things to get you sort of started on disaster planning. So thinking about how we can break this down and make it something that is not such a huge and daunting task. I'll pass this around at the end. So you're working on that, right? When you've gotten to step 3, you have that comprehensive plan. Those pocket response plans, they're great, but they are not a full plan, right? It doesn't cover everything, right? It'll get you started. You'll kind of see by filling it out the areas that make more sense to flesh out more. And it can really help you to get to that comprehensive, to this level 3 stage. Things that you really need to think about are those individual roles and responsibilities. They really need to be clearly defined within your institution. That can be difficult. Sometimes, the executive director isn't the right person to be in charge during a disaster, and that might be difficult for them to know. So going through that and negotiating that is all very difficult. You want to have those identified priorities. Josh did a great job already sort of talking about what those priorities might be in relation to what those essential records are that you need for operations, you need to have in a disaster. Some other criteria that I might suggest you think about as well in that is materials that are most at risk. So what are the things that if they get wet, they're ruined, right? Things like clay-coated papers. They get wet, they get sealed together, they're done, right? So those might actually be bumped up in the priority list because of their sensitivity. So that's something else that might take years to totally get figured out at your institution. You have to have good records management to make sure that is something that is under control. So that can be a difficult step as well. So that's why you got to have your little pocket response plan ready while you're still working on that full-blown comprehensive plan. And then, of course, after you have written the plan, you got to have it distributed to your staff. A plan does you no good if it's sitting on a shelf getting dusty, right? So it needs to make sure that it's going to the proper people in your institution. So just as, a plan does no good if it's just sitting on a shelf, it also doesn't really do you any good if nobody reads it and it's not practiced, right? So in order to achieve level 4, you should be practicing your emergency plan annually. So what do I mean by practicing, right? Basically, that's going through the plan, reading it through, checking it to make sure everything is still relevant, those contact lists are up to date, priorities are still correct, staff actually knows what their roles and responsibilities are, what they're actually doing in the disaster. And there's several different ways that you can do this, can practice it. One of my kind of favorite ways to do this is to do a tabletop exercise. That is a kind of low-cost, low-key sort of exercise where you gather the key personnel that would be involved in a disaster response. Everybody sits around a table and a scenario is presented. They talk about how they would respond to it. I lived in Los Angeles for a long time, so I think of it as like a table read with all your important actors and actresses at the table talking through how this plan would actually work. It's a good time to see, we've moved the collections from that room, so we need to update this portion of the plan. It's a very kind of low-cost way to go through it. If you're ambitious, you could put together sort of a larger functional exercise, which is one of those more sort of hands-on where you get the kiddie pools out there and pull stuff out and actually break into your response teams. Those ones are pretty fun. I've done a lot where I take my kiddie pool around the state, and lots of precious artifacts from Goodwill come with me and go into the kiddie pool, and they have to get salvaged. You can actually break into the teams that you'll really be using and see, this team doesn't work well together. We gotta separate this out. So it's a good way to get another view on how your plan will actually work. And then adjustments should be made to the plan according to those outcomes. Another crucial key to preparedness is having supplies stocked and on hand. Again, it's all well and good if the emergency plan directs you to protect shelving units with plastic sheeting if a pipe bursts, but if you don't have plastic sheeting, that directive doesn't help you at all. So you want to make sure that you really do have those supplies on hand, stocked, ready to go. Supplies for collections response might include things like blotter paper, holotex, Mylar, some of those weirder things that you would need to order. It might take a while to get there, so you want to make sure that they're already there. You should also be stocking your personal protective gear because, as Josh actually mentioned, we are more important than the collections, believe it or not. So, gloves, dust masks, goggles, things like that. While testing or practicing your plan, it might also be beneficial to, actually go through your disaster supplies, make sure everything is there, and it's all in good working order. You want to make sure that the plastic sheeting is actually there and they didn't take it to go do another project and never replace it, right? Happens a lot. So if you're looking for a place to start with what supplies you might need, on the CCAHA website, I have a list of kind of what I think are good things for a starter kit. You can find that at ccaha.org/resources. A bunch of other resources there as well that I've been working on compiling over the years. So similarly to having those supplies stocked, you want to also have your contracts made and up to date. It's great again if your plan says that you're going to be calling a specific conservator, but it doesn't really help if that conservator wasn't pre-approved for it, your insurance doesn't cover it, that conservator doesn't know who you are. You want to make sure that those are things that have also been established ahead of time. It's not something you want to be working out during a disaster when minutes are precious. So once we have done that, we have become a disaster preparedness leader. So you've achieved all of those preparedness measures at your institutions. You can become a leader to those in the areas surrounding you. Something that I've been working on a lot through the PaCRN project that David mentioned is putting together regional Alliance for Response networks. So to give you a little background about what Alliance for Response is, AFR for short, it is an initiative that looks at bringing together cultural heritage institutions and emergency manager professionals on sort of a local level. That's where all disaster response occurs. So it's best to sort of know who you're talking to and who's going to help you out. So this originally began in 2003, and it's gone on since then to have a lot of sort of big cooperative disaster networks established all over the country. As I said before, it's not only getting to know who are your other cultural heritage institutions who might be able to help you out, but who are those emergency managers that are going to need to be familiar with your site. So I'm happy to say that here in Pennsylvania, we have the most comprehensive network of AFRs of any other state in the country. So that's been really great. We have 7.5, I'm going to say, networks. And I say 0.5 because G over there, the South Central region, where we are right now, has been a little bit lacking. These are all volunteer-run networks, and so if there aren't volunteers who are super up for the challenge, they're not quite at that preparedness leader level at their institution, it can be harder for them to do it. So, if you are in that area and feel like you are close to the preparedness leader level, come talk to me. I'd love to get you set up with some of the networks around here. Similarly, if you're in some of those gray areas where there aren't a network, let me know. I'd love to blow our 8 networks out of the water and have even more. But the other networks are all pretty active. The 2 biggest ones are obviously A and B. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh are our 2 biggest networks, not surprisingly. But a lot of the other ones do a lot of other things. They have regular meetings, workshops. Some of them have even been able to work together to get grants to share among the group. The Erie Network, which is the Northwest Group C, they were just awarded a grant to expand their network. So some institutions are even getting some money out of that. Another benefit with them is that each of the networks have a shared disaster supply cache. So they have this cache that they're sharing of some of those weirder supplies like Holotex blotter that you might need that you don't want to wait for shipping. So being a part of that alliance, you will get access to that cache, which is a great benefit. So if you are looking for more information on how to join one of these networks, you can reach out to me or check the AFR Philadelphia website, which is afrphilly.wordpress.com, and I have a list of all the networks and their contact information there under the resources page. Okay, so even if you are prepared as possible, you're a preparedness leader, you're super connected, sometimes disasters do still happen, right? Arsons can happen. Heavy rains can cause floods. There's only so much you can do to control these things, right? So the next section in our matrix, the preparedness blocks here, have to do with disaster response. And that is those immediate actions taken following a disaster that maximize the amount of materials saved. So this is a really pivotal time in a disaster. Those initial steps, they can really be crucial in preventing the disaster from spreading or making sure that those effects of the disaster are minimized. For example, molds can begin growing on collections materials in the first 24 to 48 hours when something gets wet. So, given the right or wrong, I guess, conditions, that it can really go quickly. So the quicker you are able to get to those materials, the better chance you have at reducing damage. So that is why having a good disaster response in place is really critical. Your first level is awareness again. And, I just gave that example about having a quick collections-related response, but it's still really important for all of us to remember. I know it's tough for us collections people to remember, but we are not actually the most important thing. We have human health and safety first, stabilization, and then comes the protection of property and collections. So in level 1, you are aware that these are your priorities. This is actually the same priorities that all emergency managers, all first responders are going to be coming in with these priorities in line as well. So it's helpful if you can sort of speak the same language with them and understand their priorities when you're trying to advocate for your priorities as well. And I keep saying, I know how important all collections are to us, but it can really mess up the response if we go out of order here and can cause more damage in the long run. I heard a story once about a flood at the University of Hawaii campus. Their library is in the basement. Great place, as always. There was a flood that came through, went right into the basement of where they had some of their special collections. So one of the librarians, very attached to the collection, went charging into the basement before the floodwaters were cleared. The floodwaters were dirty, so you couldn't see all the way through. And though he knew the place like the back of his hand, what he didn't know is that that floodwaters busted off that bottom step to his basement. And so though he was expecting a step to be there, it wasn't there. He stepped off, he broke his ankle. So then he had to be evacuated out, which slowed down the response, right? Because we're going to bump back up. Emergency managers are going to want to take care of human life and safety first. So he had to be evacuated before they could really go on with the incident stabilization. And then he had to go to the ER and get his ankle dealt with. So he didn't even get to participate in that response anyway. So it really ended up slowing everything down, made the situation much worse. So that's why it's very important that staff knows this is the priority and this is what we follow. We do not enter the building until it has been cleared. We don't get going until things have been stabilized. The better relationships you have with your emergency managers through things like that Alliance for Response Network, the smoother that's going to go and the quicker they're going to want to help you to achieve your goals as well. So, but knowing those goals is the first step here in disaster response. At level 2, you should have those priorities addressed in written form, right, in your disaster plan. It should reflect those priorities. In your pocket response template, it's a good place you can start off with having that in there right away so everybody knows. Really helps you kind of outline those immediate first steps of how do you deal with getting human safety first covered, and then how do you deal with then the incident stabilization. Incident stabilization is a big one. It's that second priority, and it's a big one. That includes things like stopping the ingress of water from coming in, keeping air circulating so that mold doesn't grow, reducing humidity. These immediate procedures really help to save the most material in the long run. You know what the easiest way to prevent collections from getting ruined by water is? To let them get wet by water in the first place, right? So, it doesn't make much sense to kind of start pulling out books of records with the water still coming down. That's going to get everything else wet. All the other things that were once dry might be wet by the time you get to them. So really focusing on how do I stop that water first is kind of makes a lot more sense. You can quickly throw some plastic sheeting over something and then go figure out how you turn off the water to the building. That sort of makes a little bit more sense than just running in there and pulling out boxes, right? So thinking with that sort of mindset can help a lot in getting your response done properly. Of course, a lot of the immediate action items will depend a lot on the incident. If it's a fire, you'll do one thing. If it's water, you'll do another thing. But the trick is to keep those priorities in mind and thinking about those 3 steps and being sort of flexible of what that response looks like. It's good to have some solid action items, but even more important is having staff who can make those judgment calls because they've had training, because they have a plan to refer to for those different incidents. Which leads me to my next level, which is level 3 here, in having that comprehensive plan. So staff should have received verbal or, hands-on demonstrations on how to stabilize affected records, including pack-out procedures, how to begin doing air drying, freezing, staging for vendors, in the best available environment. So immediate response procedures are incorporated into your preparedness plan at this level. So if staff know about the steps, the 3 priorities, they have a familiarity with how to do some of that salvage, they'll be better equipped to make those quick decisions about, I'm going to throw the plastic sheeting and turn off, and they'll be better equipped to do that. So there should be some sort of staff training on record stabilization. Hands-on demos are really great way to do that, but even just verbal or written instructions are helpful as well. There's a lot of salvage videos online. FAIC has a YouTube channel where they have some sort of visuals on it. There's lots of resources that kind of walk you through salvage on the CCAHA website I mentioned. There's a couple of guides there for salvaging materials. This is another fun one. It's the disaster response wheel. It's another one put out by FAIC. And it has, on the back here, it has sort of those immediate salvage steps. You can do it here for depending on the materials. So you can find this online again, the same place as this book, but I'll pass them both around afterwards. So you want to make sure that you're also discussing how to pack out materials to send them for freezing, when freezing is appropriate, how to begin air drying, as I was mentioning before. In your training, I do really like a lot of those online guides. They're super helpful, but I do really think there's nothing like a hands-on experience, right? Standing in that kiddie pool of water. You don't have to necessarily do a kiddie pool. You can get little bins, do something that way. There's nothing like, feeling what happens with a book when it gets wet. It swells, right? What does that actually feel like? What does it look like? It's nothing is better than sort of that getting to touch it and feel it. It's one thing to read about how to, say, deploy a fire extinguisher, but actually doing it is a little bit more useful. So when you're actually doing it in real life, it's not the first time you've had to do it. It's difficult to put on those sort of hands-on training events. I will be the first to tell you, as I've done a lot of them. It's, very time and labor intensive, a lot of work. So, I recommend if you see kind of opportunities to jump in on some of those, take advantage of them. Through my job, I'm often, taking it on the road and doing some of those salvage workshops all over the state. We've done one with the state archives before. Hopefully we'll be able to do more in the future. Many of the Alliance for Response groups that I mentioned put on their own salvage workshops as well. A lot of them do have preparedness leaders in their area, so they have this expertise. And so they're able to put on some of those hands-on workshops as well. The fire departments can conduct, those fire extinguisher trainings if you want something a little bit less focused on collections, but still important. So it doesn't have to be something that you necessarily put on yourself, but you're encouraging staff to participate in that kind of training and getting that hands-on experience, or reading about it, right? So in order to achieve level 4, your staff should be doing this kind of practice every year. This is a picture actually from one of the trainings, and look who's right over here. You can kind of not see him so well. He's in his casual clothes here, but that's Josh. So we do practice what we preach up here. We try to do all of the trainings ourselves as well. So anyway, so staff should have practice and be proficient in stabilizing affected records, including those pack-out procedures, knowing the priorities, how to air dry, freezing, all of that sort of information. May Day is a good kind of day to remember to do some sort of training. September is National Preparedness Month. I like to use those 2 months as sort of my reminders to check in with groups. I do some training at the Conservation Center as well with staff there. So I like to use those as my check-in dates, and it stays pretty regular every year. We've already talked about how to practice the plan, right? Some of those tabletop exercises, the functional things. So you can maybe kill 2 birds with 1 stone, right? And do some practice on record stabilization and also looking at your plan. So maybe you do a tabletop exercise in the morning and review some online literature. For 1 year as sort of one of a lower cost, lower effort sort of training, and maybe the next year you pull out the kiddie pools, right? So you don't have to do the full intense thing every year, but having that sort of regular check-in to make sure that people have this sort of in the front of their mind. It's, really unlikely, right, that you'll actually have to respond to a real disaster in between the trainings. At least that's the hope, right? So having, it's easy to kind of forget the things that if you're not doing them with any sort of frequency. Am I supposed to use wax paper or blotter paper for wrapping things to go to freezers? I know I use wax paper because it's second nature to me as I think about this a lot, but you might not know that if the last time you thought about it was 3 years ago, right? So just having those check-ins every year so that it comes sort of as second nature as possible to you. I heard a statistic once that your brain only functions at 20% in an emergency. Not sure how true that is. I do think, when things are going, it can be easy to forget the things that you know. So as much as the more you can sort of ingrain some of these things into your brain, the easier it is to do when you need to. So at level 5, when you are a preparedness leader, you have fully taken care of the response at your own institution and you are able to help others. David sort of mentioned this a little bit this morning too, but one way to really be a preparedness leader at level 5 is to be a member of the Pennsylvania Cultural Response Team. And so that's being able to provide expertise to other repositories who might be facing records-related disasters. So to give you a little bit of background on what the Pennsylvania Cultural Response Team is, it was launched in 2016, so we're still pretty new, with about 50 members. We're now closer to about 30 members, but members are trained in all topics of disaster response, preparedness, all the things we've been talking about today, and they are available to be deployed across the state to help other cultural institutions. To sort of manage an incident if needed. The volunteers are super committed. You will not find a more committed group of volunteers. They do annual training, both hands-on and online literature review. This year, the homework for the response team members are to put together quick sheets, one-page guides about how to salvage various materials. I'm hoping to maybe make those available for other people later, but it's just a way for them to kind of, this is what I do, practicing what we were just talking about, so it comes to them quickly. Most of them have done, the hands-on kiddie pool stuff. They're always jumping at opportunities. Anytime I do a training, I know there's always at least one response team member involved. They're always very interested in getting into those training opportunities. So the idea behind the team is that if you're having a disaster, you're not going to get the whole 30 people there. You'll probably get one person there who's going to help you to manage that incident. If you're not as prepared as you wish you were during a disaster, somebody can come in who has experience with salvage, can get you started on that, knows what vendors are appropriate, knows what other resources are out there, and can help you to kind of interface with your first responders, your emergency managers. They've done a lot of training on how to speak to emergency managers, so they can help you to kind of get through that disaster. Now, we aren't running into burning buildings or anything like that to pull out records and anything like that. We're for the sort of longer term part of it. But they're there and they are there for free. So how do you access PaCRN, you might be wondering. The team is managed through the Conservation Center. So you just give me a call, actually, is how you access them. And then depending on where you're located, I try to match you with a nearby team member. Sometimes I might try to match you with somebody who has expertise in your particular area. If you're a historic building, I'll try to match you with someone who has a little bit more historic building information. So I do a lot on the eastern side of the state. There's a woman named Miranda Nixon who is the Western State Coordinator. And she does a lot of help on the western side of the state. We're still looking for a central coordinator, so if anyone's interested, let me know. But they're a great resource, and I'm hoping to be recruiting more people for that team in the future, so keep your eyes peeled if you feel you are at that leader level and want to do more for the state. All right, so now on to recovery. So what does it mean and how is that different from response? It's a good question, right? This has more to do with sort of those long-term efforts that includes kind of the conservation treatment following the response phase. So this is different from those stabilization things that I mentioned. It's not, just wrapping something up to send it to a freezer. It's the more in-depth stuff. It's not really something that can be done by anybody either, right? Just about anybody can prepare a moldy book to go to a freezer, for example, but freezing is not the full treatment. It won't eliminate the mold or anything like that. It's only a stabilization. So the book will have to be treated and go through remediation by an expert. So that is this step, different from that immediate response onto the long-term recovery. Other examples might be, removing soot from things after it's been in a fire situation. Tide lines, on paper when it gets wet, it pushes, you can treat that, right? Wavy papers can get flattened, right? Afterwards. The bad news is, the good news is that you can do a lot of this. This is stuff you can do. The bad news is that it's pretty expensive. So, and that's expensive because the people that do it are, very highly qualified, lots of education, a lot of really specialized equipment is needed for that. But that's why knowing and preparing for costs ahead of time is really important in this disaster response and recovery aspect of it. And here's actually a picture from some of our conservators at the Conservation Center working on a treatment after a disaster. So, again, that first step is awareness, getting a handle on what is long-term recovery and identifying conservators in your area. You want to know, who's available and what type of materials they can work with. Paintings conservators are not that helpful if you don't have paintings, right? Now, all conservators do have some general training that will include a lot of those stabilization methods that I talked about. So a painting conservator could be really helpful if you don't have any paintings and still preparing some of those materials. So in that respect, they're great, but they won't be able to, rebind a book or something if it's been water damaged. So there is a difference there. You might be wondering, how do I find a conservator? Luckily for you, I have an answer. The American Institute of Conservation has a Find a Conservator page on their website. So you can just Google AIC, Find a Conservator, and it'll pop right up. So on that page, you can enter your zip code, enter what sort of specialty you're looking for, so what types of materials you have. You have mostly books, you have mostly paper, textiles, paintings, whatever it might be. And the website will provide you names and contact information as well as how far away they are from you. So it's a great way to kind of get a sense of who's out there. You're also, of course, welcome to give us a call at CCAHA. We have conservators who work with paper, books, and photographs, but we have relationships with other conservators who do other disciplines. So if you're not sure where to go, we can help to point you in a direction as well. It is super important that your conservators are trained and are part of an organization like AIC. There isn't like a true accreditation process for conservators, but you'll often find there are many sort of untrained restorers out there who do things that might be considered a disaster all by themselves, right? So we don't want to cause more damage to things, and making sure that people have the right sort of affiliations, have had the right sort of training, and making sure they're using appropriate treatment methods. And as you would with any vendor, you should, talk about their background and ask for references and call them, right? So same thing applies when dealing with conservators. So in the basic plan, you have an established relationship with that conservator, right? So you can find conservators all day. You can put together a huge list based on the FAIC Find a Conservator page and based on our recommendations. But if you don't have a relationship established with them ahead of time, that might not be so helpful. Conservators usually don't charge by the hour. We're not like lawyers or anything, so feel free to give them a call or email them ahead of time to kind of talk to them about what it might be like working with them in a disaster. They're usually happy to answer questions. They might be able to give you information about like hourly rates, just what sort of treatments they can perform, that sort of thing as well. Also, you'll want to let them know that you'll be listing them as a contact in your disaster plan. It's good for them to be prepared as well. Know that this might come your way. You'll always want to check to make sure that conservation treatment is covered by your insurance policy as well. So I'm going to be the first to tell you I'm not an expert in insurance. It's a very, very tricky topic. Hopefully there's someone at your organization who might know a little bit more than me about it that you can talk to and make sure all of this is covered. Or if not, you can call your insurance agent and ask what is covered specifically. Conservation treatment is expensive. It's not something you're going to want to pay for out of pocket, especially as you have a lot of these other sort of disaster-related expenses. So make sure it's covered in your policy. Typically, a fine arts insurance policy is what you need for historic or artistic works, but please double check that and see what works for your institutions. Make sure the vendors that you're working with, including conservators, are approved of and covered by your insurance. You want to make sure that is all taken care of ahead of time so that you don't have to be figuring out those messy details in the midst of a disaster. In your comprehensive plan, you will even go a little bit further. Depending on that insurance policy, you'll still probably have to pay some out-of-pocket expenses. So, the same goes for a lot of other services too. It'll be up to a certain amount that is covered or not. So you want to make sure you have a handle on that ahead of time, knowing that policy really closely. But it's also a good idea to have some sort of nest egg or sinking fund to cover the rest of those costs. Some treatments will need to be done relatively quickly to avoid further damage from waiting. So you won't necessarily have time to start a fundraising campaign as you would with a lot of other conservation treatments. You might need to go quick. So having that fund on hand is really, really crucial. And will save you costs in the long run. If something gets worse because the damage is allowed to sit, it'll be more expensive than if you're able to do it quickly and upfront. So you'll need to think about what you're doing also in the meantime when conservation is happening. And this really ties in well to what Josh was talking about with those essential records. Which records are you going to need access to do your regular business? Which are you going to need access to for your visitors? What are you going to need for your staff? How are you going to, are there digital copies that you can access? Is this hard copy the only version? Thinking about that and how you're going to get all of that taken ahead of time so that you're not frantically trying to get something finished or, trying to digitize something that has burn marks on it and you've lost information, things like that. So this is part of having an up-to-date records management policy and having identified those essential records ahead of time. Ideally, a lot of those issues would be addressed in a continuity of operations plan so that your organization can continue to function even without some of those important documents or whatever the other version is that you'll be using. In level 4, your established program, you would have a contract in place with the conservation lab so that the recovery phase can happen quickly and easily so that you can have those essential records returned to you as quickly as possible. For example, I do believe the State Archives has a contract in place with my organization, CCAHA, so all of the costs have been agreed upon, predetermined. Insurance knows about CCAHA. It makes the billing happen a lot quicker. We can get started on projects a lot faster. Our conservation staff is already very familiar with the types of records that the State Archives have. They know, which are the most important ones, what need to be addressed. They understand the significance of many of the records. So if a disaster were to happen at the State Archives, CCAHA would be able to spring into action right away to make sure that materials are treated and dealt with quickly and efficiently. So that is a good place to be at, and not even that difficult to reach in a lot of cases. It's just some phone calls and figuring out some of the details. If you are a preparedness leader, you would have an in-house staffed conservation lab and can assist other repositories when they need help. So I don't expect everybody to have this, right? Having a conservation lab is pretty expensive and might not be totally worth it for your institution. So this is one that I think maybe is not in an ideal world, sure, but I think if you are at level 4, you are still a preparedness leader for this particular one. But having those relationships, and if you are able to help other people, that's definitely a thing that I'm very keen on so that we can all move forward together. As David mentioned and Josh reiterated, we want everybody to be as close as they can to that level 5 preparedness leader, and this is a way helping out other people is definitely one of the biggest parts of that. So I'm going to pass the mic back over to Josh, but thank you.
Samantha. Okay, so again, today we sort of unveiled this project that we've worked with Samantha on to develop this tool. So we have the 5 steps in each category, and of course we had essential records that we talked about. We talked about disaster preparedness, disaster response, and ultimately disaster recovery. And each one of those we had the awareness, basic plan, comprehensive plan, established program, and ultimately with the goal or intention or hope of becoming a preparedness leader. So we hope that this document, this tool, ultimately is a call to action, and we hope that these general steps will encourage you to further explore how to progress along that matrix. And as I mentioned, we hope to have this posted online in the next several months. We're still working on developing all the links and the additional information that we hope to provide to you for each level. But again, if you can just in many cases, as Samantha alluded to, going to management, trying to get that buy-in, talking to resource allocators, particularly as we talked about identifying some of the risks that you may be facing and so forth, really beginning with the inventory, beginning with the plans, and just progressing along that matrix. And we're certainly here and available to help and assist you along that process. With that said, we would like to open it up to any questions. If you have any questions here on site, or if there are any from the remote viewership. For the on-site folks, we'd ask that you'd stick around for a moment after the questions. Yes.
If we were to take the steps to establish a contract with the conservation lab, does that cost any money up front, or how does that work?
It will depend a lot on the center that you are working with or the conservator that you're working with. I don't believe to set one up with us you would have to do anything ahead of time. We do have a membership, which is not that expensive, and I know that usually we do prioritize, if there is a disaster, we would prioritize working with our members. So that would probably be the route, but you can definitely reach out to the Conservation Center and we can get you more details on that. I have cards also if you.
And I just changed the slide there, so contact information is available there as well. No remote questions? All right, well, I appreciate everybody's time.
That's bad.
I appreciate everybody's time. We'd like to conclude the webinar feed at this time.